I think that is a tricky question, because what is a sense of belonging, right? I like to think of it as something invisible. There's not a recipe necessarily for creating a sense of belonging, something that comes with many different activities. I don't think you can create a sense of belonging through good branding only.
Welcome to another episode of Urbcast, your podcast about cities, urbanism, and architecture, but also some other topics around urban development, real estate, and also wayfinding today. Because today we will talk about place branding and urban storytelling with special focus on some Danish urban districts, like for example the Carlsberg Byen or Tingbjerg. We discussed the role of wayfinding, urban identity, storytelling, design, and branding that they play in shaping the perception of urban spaces. We try to answer to questions like, how do you create a sense of place before it even exists? What role does history play in modern urban developments like Carlsberg Byen? And how can branding help transform the image of districts like Tingbjerg in Copenhagen from being labeled as undesirable and dangerous to becoming thriving communities? In this episode, I'm joined by Michaela Pihl Olsen, who is the head of wayfinding and place activation at Urgent.Agency, which is a Copenhagen-based strategic design agency specializing in branding, placemaking, and wayfinding to create meaningful experiences in urban spaces. Michaela believes that wayfinding is often overlooked, yet it plays a crucial role in how we navigate and connect with our surroundings. So, let's get started. Michaela, welcome to Urbcast.
Thank you so much.
And this is the interesting conversation that we're going to have because the topic is also very interesting. I've been talking in the podcast about placemaking a bit, not that much about the wayfinding. And lately I've been exploring a lot of topics like landscape design and also real estate and urban development. And here today we will talk more about the branding and this kind of visual, but not only visual side of making projects. We are here in the Urgent.Agency office in Nørrebro in Copenhagen. And I would love to introduce you to the listeners. How did you end up working here for actually almost 9 years now? So it's a long journey. Could you share something else also about your background and how did you start with wayfinding?
Thank you for having me, Martin. It's a pleasure. So yes, as you mentioned, I've been here for quite some time, 10 years soon. I think I ended up here because I was really attracted to the approach Urgent.Agency has, and it's this multidisciplinary view on design. That is also what I've been studying, so to say. So before Urgent, I'm educated an architect from the Royal Academy in Copenhagen, doing my bachelor's in the architecture school, focusing on furnitures actually and small scale architecture, and also some graphic design was introduced. And I think when I started to dig more into that discipline, I found it very interesting, and especially how you can combine graphic design with spatial design. At the school at that time, there was a master's in type and wayfinding, it was called, which is super nerdy, but I found it really interesting. I took that master's, which was a really focused 2 years within learning how to make typographies and also a lot of wayfinding, basically the mix in between communication design and also how it appears in a spatial matter. So I think that kind of formed the way that I would like to work with design in the future. So after that, I worked at an interior design company for a while, which was also more not creating big urban strategies or drawing houses or anything like that, but more into the small scale. And that was also really interesting. And then I did an internship at Contrapunkt, where they had a focus on wayfinding, and they're also famous for creating a lot of big wayfinding projects for companies like DSB and the pharmacies in Copenhagen and the airport, Copenhagen airport. And that started a little bit also that career path, I would say, and led me to Urgent, where I've been part ever since. Urgent has this interdisciplinary focus on the field of design, and I just think that is both fun and important, and also really interesting.
Let's talk about this intersection of architecture and wayfinding. So, was architecture something that helped you find your way into wayfinding? Or would you say that also even without architecture, you would be well positioned to do wayfinding master?
I don't know, since I didn't go that way around, but I can only answer that I think that through the architecture discipline and also field, I think that I have another approach to wayfinding that is being able to have the spatial skill set, I would say, or architectural skill set, and also the anthropological view of human beings in a space, that relation. I think that is something that you get from studying architecture, obviously. And then I think it's also a little bit back to the teacher that I had at school. He's called Sten Eilers. And there has been a lot of architects throughout our Danish history, like Arne Jacobsen, they have also been making actually graphic design and typographies, and also creating more detailed aspects of the architectural buildings that they have created. And I think that holistic view and approach was something that my teacher back at the school back in the days also introduced us for a lot. And this was a rich tradition that we have. So I think that kind of also nudged me in that direction, getting to know this way of working with architecture also really holistically.
Before we started, you said that wayfinding is actually not that popular in Denmark, that there are not that many offices. How come with the design legacy you have?
I think it's a mix of, as you say, it is part of our legacy, this master that I did at the school. That it's for one, it's no longer part of the school, so it's not introduced properly as a discipline or as a field focus. So I think you lose a lot of course, attention there. Also, just on student level, so to say. I think it places itself within different stakeholders in the field. So the people that do wayfinding today, as I see it, is architectural companies. Some are really good at it. They have like a more focused department that execute on this, often at the end of the building process. And then you have the manufacturers that are the one who produces the signs or the wayfinding and implements it. They also often actually handle the whole conceptual and the strategic process of wayfinding projects. And then you have agencies like us, where I would say that there are not so many left. So I know Contrapunkt, as I mentioned before, has had a great focus on this. I see us as one of the bigger players, and just to be like honest, in that field. And I think it's complicated because it's not really a big part of our building regulation. Art, I think, is 5% that is set aside to implement some art in our buildings, whereas signage and wayfinding is a sub-bullet that places itself within interior design as the overall category in the building phase. So something like the regulatives also doesn't help our surroundings getting great wayfinding, because there's no money, there's no focus. So there's also a political aspect of it not getting the attention that it could get.
So how would you describe Urgent.Agency approach to those disciplines? You said you are one of the kind of bigger offices who are working with the topic. So what would be your approach, and what is important in working with buildings, with places, so that they can introduce themselves properly to the users?
Yeah, so I like to think of us as one of the bigger players, at least. And of course, I acknowledge that there are many, so it's not like that. But I think our approach is, this is going to be a buzzword probably, but to think interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary about design. We used to say that we have two main focuses, that is corporate branding and place branding. So we are a branding agency, but we still work with placemaking in some extent. And I think that our approach is to create meaningful and authentic stories. It's about storytelling at the end of the day. And you can create that via visual language, communication, branding, but also via pointing at engagement and activities that then strengthen a visual layer, so to say. So I think it's both looking into it from a bottom up and a top down perspective.
And what about the sense of belonging? Can you, through your work, either with like wayfinding and placemaking, create a sense of belonging? If so, how could this branding also foster inclusion?
What is a sense of belonging? And I like to think of it as something invisible. There's not a recipe necessarily for creating a sense of belonging, something that comes with many different activities. I don't think you can create a sense of belonging through a good branding only. It comes down to a combination of a lot of disciplines. Like, for instance, in a new urban area, it would also take, of course, a clever and well-created urban strategy, good architecture, someone looking into what activities would be there, who will inhabit it, and how will this become a new great area to live in. Sense of belonging is like almost a spirit of a place, I would say. But what I can say is that I think what branding can do in that matter is that it creates a visuality and something that you can recognize. And as soon as you recognize something, you have already created a connection to the people, so to say. So that is one ingredient in the course of creating sense of belonging.
I really like this notion of spirit of a place, the genius loci, which is something that you can either create or help create, or sometimes it's just there. It's something that we find when we go to some places, to some beautiful small narrow streets or alleys, and you go there and you feel that, okay, that's the sense of the place. I really like this concept in cities, in city making and in creating places, right? One more element is something about the soft and more physical layer to that. Can we differentiate soft and physical activation and how to balance those more kind of spiritual and social elements together with the physical ones?
I think so. And I think they need each other in order to create a great place or this sense of belonging. One physical element could be to create a good wayfinding system. And a wayfinding system, in the way we view it, and I do, is not only about the rational part. It's not only about navigation. It's not only about finding your way from A to B, but it's also thinking about the wayfinding concept as being a communicative tool that strengthens a vision of a place, or maybe a historical aspect, the visual identity of a place. It's prolonging something, and it has to strengthen an overall vision in order for it to be a good physical asset in this matter, I would say.
When we talk about those physical aspects, and maybe here coming back to wayfinding, it's not only about the signs, it's not only about the signage, so it's not only about how you show the way. It's way more than that.
I think a lot of people think of it as signage, which it is also. But it can also be storytelling elements like environmental graphics, it's called. So, for instance, I'll mention Carlsberg Byen. I think it's a great new urban district in Copenhagen. It's a great experience, and they have a rich history. And obviously, it's also often a balance in how do you prolong a history or strengthen it. And sometimes there can also be a tendency of people wanting to find some historic element and strengthen that, but it has to have some kind of volume in order for it to make sense to also strengthen the history. But in Carlsberg Byen's matter, I think it makes a lot of sense since it's a combination of new housing and also with the old buildings and area and the whole history of Carlsberg, of course. In that way, they play on the history with also strengthen the storytelling of it. And there are a lot of like environmental graphics. Maybe you've noticed it if you go there at some point, where they kind of also have decorated some of the facades with graphic elements that tells the story of the area where when they made the beer originally. And this can be also a little bit banal, but also calling the streets that has a historical reference back to that area. I think that combination of physical elements and storytelling and wayfinding can actually create that feeling of an area.
The streets names, it's something I wanted to mention as well, because I've been to Carlsberg Byen many times, and I realized from the first time there's something going on there around the branding, because there are the street names is the one thing, but then there is this signage, the logo of Carlsberg Byen that is on the buildings, and you kind of feel that, okay, I'm entering like a zone. But how do you approach that in such a scale? Because basically we are talking about a big district of a city, and sometimes I guess it might be challenging to place branding and wayfinding for a single building. So how do you do it in such a big scale?
Carlsberg Byen, they started the communication before even digging into the ground, right? In order to and that is also how you create like a place that is not existing yet. That was through the website and through the storytelling on the website. So they were able to communicate about what was going to happen before they even started the process. So that is quite an effective tool, obviously, in that already trying to create a connection and also to attract partners, right? Like commercial partners or other partners. So that is also a tool of creating the place before it exists, by also getting some partners on board and get them to do some work and some communication on behalf. Now it's down to a new area. It could be anything, right? We haven't, unfortunately, been part of creating Carlsberg Byen. I think it's Brick who's done a lot of work also there, and some different architectural companies. I think in their case, I know that they're still cooperating a lot, and they're still like the main partner in still selecting which activities are going to place itself in Carlsberg Byen, which commercial aspects should be there, and I know it's a really like picky selection, so it fits the segment also that lives there, and also of course catering to different target groups, so people with children, elderly, I imagine everyone basically, because there's quite a big diversity in Carlsberg Byen. I would say mainly, of course, children and families live there. That is my impression, at least. Back to your question, I think that it's these small cues that is implemented in the city. So if you go around, you would also see on the facades that they use the what do you call it when you make beer? The corn, like as a symbol. And also actually have it in the facades of the buildings in a really subtle way. I could imagine that some would think that is hideous. I think it's beautiful and great. And since it's subtly made, if you notice it, you notice it. But when you do, you would also immediately know that, okay, I'm in this area. And it just strengthens that feeling of being in a district.
But you also said before, it's also about the kind of branding's role in the transition, because Carlsberg Byen wanted to position as a kind of car-free district, or at least with some limited amount of car traffic. It fits into the Copenhagen's car-free vision as a whole. What's the branding's role in such a big transition? Because here we are not talking only about a district, but about like this kind of overall concept of less cars in city center.
When we work with wayfinding, I think it's always the best situation if you can enter a process really early, at really early stages. And I think it's the same with city planning or placemaking, branding, or whatever we call it. What we have done sometimes is that before the architectural plans are made and they get on board, we enter the process and create value programs. So it's collaboration with maybe the developers of the place, sometimes the architects, but it's creating a strategy that is often boiled down to a value program that would then infuse everything that you react upon from that stage. And that is a guideline, basically. that is helpful. Sometimes that is not done. So that is where storytelling also can become a little bit forced, because you will then, at a too late stage in the process, have to figure out what is this place, what is the narrative, how do we get people to feel a sense of belonging, and if it comes too late in the process, it's risky because a lot of the development has already found its place. So that is where we have a role in, I would say, placemaking, at least as a branding agency, is that we often also create these value programs and also some proof points. Because if you don't also point on how do you then create action upon these value programs, it will always just become a written document. So we also try to point at some activities that would then strengthen this strategy.
Let's talk about one more example, which is a very interesting example, the main example I wanted to discuss. And this is the district that is going under the transformation now. So hopefully it's not too late to integrate some of that. Let's discuss about Tingbjerg, which is a district which had some challenges and is trying to change this image from unsafe to desirable. And also there's this collaboration with Danish developer Nrep. Could you, before we dive into the changes in the district, can you just quickly paint a picture of what is this district about?
As you're saying, we had the privilege of collaborate with Nrep, strengthening Tingbjerg as an area. And Tingbjerg is a really interesting place, really close by Nørrebro, where we're at, and actually has a really rich history. Was planned by an architect called Sten Eilers Rasmussen. It's a really well-known architect. And he had this vision when creating Tingbjerg of creating the best place for children. He called it in Danish, it's drømmeby for børn, like a dream place for children, almost Peter Pan-ish. That was his vision. So that was also what he then tried to develop with this area, and also a lot of integrated the nature, the landscape. What has happened throughout a longer period is that, unfortunately, it has placed itself as a more dodgy place, and it places itself on the ghetto list. So obviously there is a challenge. There's been a challenge, and maybe still is at some point, but hopefully less, in that area of attracting and also keeping people to live there. Nrep collaborated with, I think it's Vandkunsten, in order to create some new buildings and also attract new people to live there. And the whole process of also attracting new people was a really tough screening process. So it was not for speculative real estate developments or people who would then just buy a building and sell it. So they had to actually, I think, promise that they wouldn't sell it within 5 years, also to keep inhabitants to live there and strengthen a new mix, I would almost say, of people. But there was a need for the image also to change a little bit. So when you Google Tingbjerg, what will come up would be like not super nice pictures online, and ghetto list and crime would be some of the buzzwords. So we got the challenge and honor to try to change that image. And we did so by, first of all, collaborating really closely with Nrep, of course, but also locally with some of the organizations in Tingbjerg, and trying to figure out, okay, what is the actual story of this place? Since it's so rich, we found it natural to try to go back to the roots and try to strengthen this through a new visual identity that would then play on this image that the architect had, a new website, and also a repetitive communication about the area, about the changes that was going on. But alongside that, as we talked about earlier, also some physical aspects to go along with this. We also created a wayfinding concept that is yet to be implemented, but that was meant to guide people around the area and view new parts of Tingbjerg. They have a tradition of having this, it's called Tingbjerg Challenge, which is a sports activity. And we also strengthened that, created a new sub-brand for that within the overall visual identity. And I know NREP also worked a lot with that Tingbjerg challenge as the activity, and also trying to attract other people to participate in it. Other physical aspects, we've also done some exhibitions, talking to the people living there, showing the life there, basically displaying their view on Tingbjerg. So it has been both on some engaging activities, but also on of course, on the more hardcore branding.
You've done this citizen study, the beboerundersøgelse of the citizens, residents of Tingbjerg. What was the outcome, and then how do you communicate the change? Because obviously it should be aligning with what the citizens, residents are thinking, both the current ones and the new ones, although actually it might be quite hard to get a grip of the ones that are to move in to the district. But so what were these findings and how do you communicate it?
Yes, so before we started the process, the word safety was mentioned a lot. And somehow the more you talk about safety, the more unsafe you actually feel at some point. So it was very much about tipping this balance, not having to always talk about safety as the first word, but finding other strategic ways of talking about Tingbjerg. Before, and I forgot to mention that before we did the visual identity, we did a strategy, a brand strategy, with core narratives for their communication, with some key messages that they could use in daily life, in communication. And that was also a great guideline for them to kind of not having always to mention it's safe here, because that was what the tendency was. And so we helped them by giving them various ways of communicate about Tingbjerg, with, of course, the focus of creating this new vision and image with the historical aspect in mind.
What do you think will be the next chapter for a district like Tingbjerg? So with the help of the strategy and the citizen involvement and the branding, the communication of the whole project, and with the new citizens moving in, but still the context being quite different, like the current citizens and so on. What's your kind of take on the future development of that interesting mix of different things?
I'm really curious on how it's, if you would take the temperature, so to say, today, how it's actually going. I know that they have moved into these new buildings, so I don't know the actual data, or right now, like how does it even like look today? I would be really curious to dig into that. I'm hopeful, and I think, and I know that there are also other activities that they look into themselves, like also getting more commercial partners into the area, creating new cafes, restaurants, also activating the the sports hall there, making more attractive offers for the people living there, but also for people just visiting Tingbjerg. So I would hope that people would also at some point go to Tingbjerg because they have something interesting to offer, and not only for the people living there. I know for a fact that the school has changed, also that there has been an improvement how they place themselves also. And I think it's the mix of all of this development going on. Slowly but steadily, it improves.
There was this cool project of a library done by Kobe architects many years ago, and it also it started to change the whole district. It's a very famous project, like a very narrow from one side library. We encourage people, the listeners, you to visit Tingbjerg, because I think that this is a very interesting district that is going through this transformation. And yeah, I was very curious on how this kind of branding and communication side of such a complex process, how does it look like? So thanks for sharing that. And towards the end of the conversation, I would love to ask you for some recommendation. First of all, I would love to ask if you could share some tips to the listeners who are interested into wayfinding and placemaking. As you said, the master program is no longer there in Copenhagen, but would you recommend some other sources for people to learn?
So first, if it's okay, I would also just say if people are going to Tingbjerg, I would also recommend them to read about the area, because Sten Eilers, there's some books on that which are really interesting to dig into his vision and landscape approach, and that was just really interesting reading about it and how it actually looks like that. Other recommendations probably mainly be on the wayfinding area, I would say, because that is where my heart lies. So this is probably a book you all know very well, but it's the Image of the City by Kevin Lynch, which I think is just a genius and interesting book, and it's about urban design. You can say it's about how you can view well-planned city or city planning in general, and actually adopting the same ways we behave in the city into smaller scales. Into a navigational or wayfinding aspect, he talks about cities where you have landmarks. So that could, for instance, be Cope's new building in Tingbjerg. That would be a landmark for that area. And that is something that you orient yourself around, as you do in other cities when you're traveling. The Eiffel Tower, when you see that, okay, I'm close to that area or I'm far away, and so on. You also navigate around districts and zones. So in Manhattan, you have quite well-defined districts. You immediately know when you enter Chinatown, for instance, there are a lot of cues and of course cultural vibes. And then by paths and edges and all of this, you can dig more into in this book. But I think the interesting thing is that this is also how you would work in a smaller scale. So for instance, when we have to create a wayfinding system for a bigger office space or another urban area, we would use the same methods to implement this in order to create a well-functioning system. So I think that book is interesting.
Perfect. Thank you. Image of the City. It's a great recommendation. Thank you for that. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for sharing your work here at Urgent.Agency, and for being part of the podcast, sharing this very inspiring theme of wayfinding and place branding. So thanks for participating, Michaela.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who might also like it. You can also read about the topics of today's episode in a form of an article, which you will find, for example, on Urbcast's LinkedIn page. Thank you, and talk to you soon in 2 weeks.